June 23, 1942. A Focke-Wulf Fw-190 cuts through the clouds at 380 miles per hour, its BMW 801 radial engine thrumming with raw power. The pilot, Oberleutnant Armin Faber, feels the control stick respond instantly beneath his fingers. He has just emerged victorious from a dogfight with a Spitfire, his gun still warm. The radio crackles with excited German voices. 2 Spitfires confirmed destroyed, no Focke-Wulfs lost. Faber's lips curl into a satisfied smile. The British machine, for all its legendary grace, could not match what he now pilots. He did not turn harder than the Spitfire. He did not try. He fought differently. He fought with energy. What Faber understood, what that captured aircraft at RAF Pembry would later confirm, was that the rules of air combat had begun to shift. The Spitfire embodied an entire tactical philosophy born in the desperate days of 1940, when the Hurricane and the elegant elliptical wing fighter from Southampton fought with honor and sacrifice against the Luftwaffe. In those days, turning radius meant everything. A fighter that could tighten its circle faster than its opponent would win. The Battle of Britain had taught the Luftwaffe's pilots that lesson in blood. But the Focke-Wulf was something new. It was not a better turner. It was something far more dangerous, a machine designed to make turning irrelevant. Consider what the RAF pilots encountered when the Fw-190 arrived over France in August 1941. The first combat report came like a shock. 2 Spitfires were downed, no losses to the new German fighter. The intelligence reports that filtered back to fighter command carried a note of confusion. The aircraft was faster than the Spitfire Mach V at most altitudes. It could roll quicker than anything in the British inventory. Its armament was extraordinary. 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. Concentrated firepower that made a Spitfire's 8 machine guns look like children's toys. Most unsettling was its ability to break off combat. When a Spitfire turned to pursue, the Fw-190 would dive away at tremendous speed, accelerating in the descent until it was gone, left behind entirely as the British fighter struggled to match its dive performance. A Spitfire pilot described the sensation of watching a Fw-190 escape as watching a ghost slip through his fingers. The root of this advantage lay in a fundamental truth about energy in air combat. Energy exists in 2 forms, altitude and speed. Most fighters of the era were designed to be superior in one dimension of dogfighting, the turning fight, the vertical climb, or the dive. But the Fw-190, especially the refined D-series models that would emerge in 1943, was built on a different principle entirely. It was an energy fighter in the most complete sense. It would not win by outturning its enemy. Instead, it would accumulate and conserve energy, while its opponents squandered theirs. Picture a typical engagement. A Spitfire pilot spots a Fw-190 at his altitude. The Spitfire, graceful and responsive, immediately hauls back on the control stick, beginning a climbing turn. This is what he was trained to do, what his aircraft excels at. The Fw-190 pilot sees the maneuver and responds differently. He does not match the turn. Instead, he rolls away and pushes the nose down slightly, trading altitude for speed. As the Spitfire climbs and turns, burning energy in every movement, the Fw-190 accelerates in its shallow dive, building velocity. In moments, the German fighter is moving significantly faster. The Spitfire pilot, now higher, feels triumph, until the Fw-190 pilot simply continues his dive, pulling up only slightly. And now the 2 aircraft are approaching from different angles at vastly different speeds. The Fw-190 pilot has positioned himself with the energy advantage. He can now choose the engagement or disengage completely, climbing away with his superior speed and acceleration. The Spitfire, exhausted from its climb and turn, cannot follow. This is the tactical revolution that haunted the RAF throughout 1942. The captured aircraft at Farnborough, piloted repeatedly by British test pilots in mock combat against the new Spitfire Mach 8-9, confirmed the worst fears. The Mechanics, equipped with the new 2-stage supercharger and more powerful Merlin engine, was a superior aircraft to the MKV. Yet even against this improved machine, the Fw-190's energy tactics remained effective. The RAF pilots had to unlearn everything they knew about turning fights and learn instead the disciplines of energy management. Instructions were hastily issued to all Spitfire squadrons. The documents were stark. To defeat this aircraft and to avoid casualties on our side, our aircraft must fly as fast as possible whenever they are in. The combat zone. The comfortable doctrine of the Battle of Britain. Engage. The enemy with maneuvers that played to British strengths had to be abandoned. The Spitfire pilot now had a single advantage: the ability to turn in a tighter circle. As one official notice grimly stated, the Spitfire V's only tactical advantage over the Fw-190 in the air is its ability to turn in a smaller circle. But that's a lot. That last phrase carried the weight of grim necessity. It was all they had. But what if this energy advantage had been wielded more systematically? What if, in the critical months of 1942 and 1943, the Fw-190 tactics had been refined further, practiced relentlessly, and pushed to their logical extreme? What if the Luftwaffe had understood that they had discovered something revolutionary? Not just a tactical variant, but a fundamental shift in the nature of air combat. Consider the reality of Fw-190 operations in these early years. The aircraft suffered from engine reliability issues that plagued its first years of service. The BMW 801 radial engine, powerful though it was, ran hot and demanded constant attention. Many Fw-190 losses were due to engine failure rather than enemy action. Furthermore, the early models had vicious handling characteristics at low speeds. Below 127 miles per hour, the Fw-190 had a tendency to stall suddenly, dropping one wing and flipping onto its back. Pilots who had converted from the Bf-109 often found the adjustment difficult. There were teething problems. There were accidents. There was friction between the manufacturers and the engine suppliers. There was, in short, chaos. Yet despite these obstacles, the tactical philosophy that the Fw-190 embodied was winning. In the Dieppe raid of August 1942, the aircraft proved devastatingly effective. The RAF committed enormous resources to this operation. 42 squadrons of Spitfire MAC-Vs, 2 squadrons of MAC-VIs, and 4 squadrons of the new MAC-Mices. The Germans responded with the Fw-190s of JG-2 and JG-26, just 2 fighter groups. The RAF claimed a stunning aerial victory, reporting 96 definite enemy aircraft destroyed. The true figures, however, told a different story. The Luftwaffe lost only 48 aircraft, half of them bombers. JG-2 lost 14 fighters and 8 pilots. JG-26 lost 6 fighters and 6 pilots. Against this, the RAF lost approximately 70 fighters with 47 pilots killed and 17 taken prisoner. The Germans had lost 20 Fw-190s and 14 pilots. They had inflicted 4 times the casualty rate they suffered. On paper, it was the Fw-190's greatest victory over the Spitfire. Now imagine a divergence. Imagine that the Luftwaffe had grasped the significance of this disparity and had reorganized their fighter tactics entirely around the principles that the Fw-190 had revealed. Imagine that instead of trying to turn with Spitfires, German pilots had been drilled relentlessly in boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, delivering a burst of cannon fire, and climbing away before the British fighter could respond. Imagine that every new Fw-190 pilot received training focused not on the traditional dogfighting that had characterized the Battle of Britain, but on energy management and vertical tactics. Imagine that the Luftwaffe had equipped every Fw-190 pilot with an understanding that their job was not to engage in prolonged turning fights, but to maximize their height advantage. Dive on the enemy, strike hard, and depart. The implications would have been profound. The Spitfire MAC-V would have been rendered obsolete even faster than it actually was. The transition to the MAC-9 would have been more desperately urgent, and perhaps even that aircraft, for all its improvements, would have found itself in a losing tactical environment. The casualty rate among Spitfire pilots would have climbed. The morale impact would have been severe, a growing sense that the Fw-190 had found an answer to which there was no response, a superior mode of combat that the British could not match, because it operated according to principles the RAF had not anticipated. But consider as well what this would have meant for the German pilots who flew this new way. Fw-190 pilot trained in energy tactics would experience air combat very differently than his opposite number in a Spitfire. The Spitfire pilot rotating through the same 2-minute turning fight again and again, learning the desperation of trying to match a machine that was designed not to be matched in maneuverability, would gradually lose confidence in his aircraft. He would come to understand that his fighter, for all its grace and responsiveness, was reactive. He was always reacting to what the Fw-190 did. He was always trying to follow, to turn inside, to create an advantage from his superior turn radius. and sometimes it worked. A Spitfire pilot with sufficient skill could exploit his machine's advantages and bring down a Fw-190, but it required precisely the right circumstances. It required the Fw-190 pilot to make a mistake. The Fw-190 pilot, by contrast, would operate from a position of initiative. He would be the one making decisions. Attack or withdraw, climb or dive. He would understand that the Spitfire was quick to turn but slow to accelerate. He would know that if he maintained energy, if he never allowed himself to be drawn into a flat-turning fight where the Spitfire's advantages could be fully exploited, he would almost always have options. He could engage or disengage at will. This is a tremendous advantage psychologically, perhaps as much as tactically. It is the difference between hunting and being hunted. In the wider context of the war in 1942 and 1943, such a shift would have meant something else as well. It would have represented a philosophical transformation in the Luftwaffe's entire approach to fighter tactics. The era of the individual aerial duel, the Spitfire and Hurricane pilots of 1940 responding to the Luftwaffe's assault with improvisation and courage, would have been replaced by something more systematic and less romantic. It would have been the triumph of science and energy management over historical tradition. It would have meant that the fighter victories that had once been the province of skilled pilots who understood their machine intimately would have become the product of systematic training in a tactical doctrine. It would have meant the future of air warfare. Some of this did, in fact, come to pass. The Fw-190D, which entered service in the winter of 1943 and 1944, was a formidable machine. With its new Jumo 213 inline engine, it could achieve speeds of 710 kilometers per hour and had a rate of climb that was genuinely impressive. In the hands of experienced pilots, it could hold its own against anything the Allies had in the sky. But by that point, the context had changed. The Fw-190D never appeared in the numbers that would have been required to reverse the course of the war. Production delays, material shortages, and the desperate situation of the Luftwaffe in 1944 meant that most German pilots never transitioned to the new model. The majority continued to fly the A-series variants, beautiful though they were in their deadliness. And by 1944, the Spitfire had evolved again. The McCourtient, powered by a Griffin engine and featuring a bubble canopy and other refinements, was a match for the best Fw-190 variants. The window of opportunity had closed. But what if it had not? What if the rapid introduction of the Fw-190D, with its superior performance and its suitability for high-altitude combat, had coincided with the kind of systematic tactical training that might have allowed the Luftwaffe to fully exploit the aircraft's capabilities? What if the battles over France in 1943 and 1944 had seen not desperate, fuel-starved pilots trying to defend the homeland with dwindling resources, but German fighters operating with the confidence that they had found a superior tactical system? The answer lies in the records of the pilots themselves. In interviews after the war, German pilots who flew the Fw-190 spoke with genuine affection for the aircraft. Adolf Galland, the great German ace, described the Fw-190 as a saber compared to the Bf-109, which he characterized as a rapier. The saber is a cutting, slashing weapon. The rapier is a thrusting weapon. The metaphor captures something essential about the difference in how these machines fought. The Bf-109, with its superior climb rate and agility at altitude, was the weapon for vertical combat. The Fw-190, with its superior roll rate and energy retention, was the weapon for horizontal combat at medium altitudes and for the boom and zoom pass. Together they formed a complementary pair. Yet the Focke-190 was never fully exploited in the way it might have been. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine remained rooted in the old ways, in the turning fight, in the vertical engagement, in the individualistic approach that had characterized German fighter tactics since the First World War. Consider what a German pilot named Wilhelm Steinhoff, who flew the Fw-190, actually experienced when he encountered a Spitfire. Steinhoff was an experienced pilot who understood energy tactics instinctively. But he was one among many. The typical Fw-190 pilot of 1942 or 1943 was not necessarily trained in the systematic application of energy management. He was trained to fly the aircraft, to understand its strengths and weaknesses, but his tactical doctrine was still the legacy of the Battle of Britain and before. In the moments before combat, he might have been thinking about turning radius and vertical climb rate rather than about energy, speed, and acceleration. This created a tragic disconnect. The aircraft was revolutionary. The pilot training was not. For the British pilot in the Spitfire, the contrast was equally stark, but it ran in the opposite direction. The Spitfire pilot was deeply imbued with a tactical doctrine that emphasized maneuverability and turning ability. These things mattered. They were not illusions. In certain specific circumstances, when the Fw-190 made a mistake, when it slowed down, when it was caught at low altitude with insufficient speed, the Spitfire's superior turn radius was absolutely decisive. A skilled Spitfire pilot could exploit these moments and achieve victory. But the Spitfire pilot was always on the defensive. He was always reacting. He was always hoping that the Fw-190 would do something that would allow him to use his advantages. And the reality was that a competent Fw-190 pilot, flying with even basic understanding of energy tactics, would simply not provide those opportunities. He would maintain his speed. He would manage his altitude. He would choose his moments. Over the breadth of 1942 and into 1943, this playing out of tactical advantage was incremental. There was no single moment of revelation, no dramatic turning point. Instead, there was a slow, grinding realization among RAF pilots and commanders that something had changed in air combat. The air superiority that they had claimed so definitively over Britain in 1940 had slipped away. The Fw-190 had not made the Spitfire obsolete, but it had made it second best. The RAF's response, the introduction of the Spitfire Make-9 and the subsequent refinement of British tactics, showed institutional flexibility and resourcefulness. But it also showed that they were playing catch-up, responding to a German innovation rather than driving events forward. There is a deeper truth here about innovation and war. Sometimes a technological or tactical innovation appears so revolutionary, so different from what has come before, that its significance is not immediately apparent. The Fw-190's energy fighting tactics were not entirely new. Earlier German pilots had recognized that diving and maintaining speed were valuable techniques. The Bf-109 was also used in boom and zoom passes, but the Fw-190 made these tactics fundamental to its design and performance characteristics in a way that nothing quite had before. It was not a machine that excelled at turning. It was a machine that made turning unnecessary. And when an aircraft makes a fundamental element of your tactical doctrine unnecessary, it forces a reckoning. Consider the moment when a Spitfire pilot first understood this reality. He had been trained to expect that he could turn inside any German fighter. He had been told repeatedly that the Spitfire was more maneuverable than the Bf-109. Now confronted with a Fw-190, he tried this maneuver. He tried to turn. The Fw-190 did not turn with him. The Fw-190 rolled away, dove, and was gone. The Spitfire pilot's entire framework of reference for how air combat worked had just been invalidated. His training told him that superior maneuverability meant victory, but he had superior maneuverability, and he had been defeated. This is the kind of realization that shakes a pilot's confidence in ways that are difficult to measure, but absolutely real. It is one thing to lose a dogfight to a pilot who flies better than you do. It is another thing to lose because the very foundation of tactical doctrine is wrong. What would have happened if this realization had come even more forcefully? What if the Fw-190 had appeared not in modest numbers in 1941 but in swarms in 1942? What if the Luftwaffe had recognized the revolutionary nature of the aircraft's capabilities even sooner, and had organized their entire fighter force around energy-fighting tactics? The casualty rate among Spitfire pilots would have climbed. The psychological impact would have been severe. There would have been a period of genuine crisis in fighter command, as commanders and pilots alike tried to understand how to respond to a tactical system that their existing doctrine could not easily counter. Yet consider as well what the German pilots would have experienced in this scenario. A Fw-190 pilot, trained from the beginning in energy tactics, would approach air combat with confidence. He would know that his aircraft was designed to be superior in the kinds of engagements that mattered most at the medium and low altitudes where much of the channel fighting took place. He would know that his job was not to match the Spitfire turn for turn, but to maintain energy, to choose the engagement, to strike hard, and to depart. He would know that this system worked. He would have seen it work repeatedly in training and in combat. This knowledge would translate into something more than just superior tactics. It would translate into superior morale. Compare this to the reality of what Fw-190 pilots actually experienced. Many of them did not fully understand the capabilities of their aircraft. Many of them were not trained in the systematic application of energy tactics. Many of them were transitioning from the Bf-109 or other aircraft and had not yet developed a deep intuitive understanding of how to fly the Fw-190 to the peak of its capabilities. The aircraft was revolutionary, but the pilots were not always flying it as if they understood that. Some of them did. Adolf Galland, for instance, seemed to grasp instinctively that the Fw-190 represented a different kind of fighting. But many others were still operating within the traditional framework of German tactical doctrine. The reality of air combat in 1942 and 1943 was therefore complex. The Fw-190 in the hands of an experienced and tactically sophisticated pilot was a formidable machine. It represented a genuine advance in fighter design and tactics. But it was not quite the revolution that it might have been. It was a revolution in a machine. It was not fully realized, a revolution in the pilot training, the tactical doctrine, and the systematic application of new principles that might have made it truly dominant. Still, in the summer of 1942, there was a moment, brief though it was, when it seemed possible that the Fw-190 might become exactly that kind of revolutionary force. The capture of that aircraft at RAF Pembry on June 23, 1942, the famous incident in which Oberleutnant Armin Faber, confused by his navigation and believing he was over France when he was actually over Wales, landed his Fw-190 at the British airfield and was taken prisoner, was celebrated in Britain as a stroke of luck. And it was. But it was also a turning point. The RAF was able to test the captured aircraft extensively. They were able to understand precisely what advantages it possessed and what weaknesses it had. Most importantly, they were able to develop tactical responses based on concrete evidence rather than speculation and field reports. Faber's aircraft, designated MP-499 by the RAF, was flown in mock combat trials against the Spitfire Mach-9. The conclusions confirmed what RAF pilots suspected. The Fw-190 was indeed a formidable machine, with significant advantages at certain altitudes and energy states. But it also had vulnerabilities. These trials, conducted in the cool environment of controlled testing rather than in the chaos of actual combat, allowed the RAF to develop a more systematic understanding of how to fight the machine. This understanding was passed on to pilots in the form of tactical instructions. These instructions emphasized the Spitfire's advantages in turning, but they also emphasized the need for Spitfire pilots to avoid prolonged engagements at altitudes or speeds, where the Fw-190's advantages would dominate. From this point forward, the air war over France and the Channel became increasingly complex. The introduction of the Spitfire Mach-9 provided a fighter that could at least compete with the Fw-190 on something approaching equal terms. The Mach-9 was faster than the Mach-V, had a better rate of climb, and with its two-stage supercharger could maintain performance at higher altitudes. It was still not clearly superior to the Fw-190 in every respect. The German fighter remained better at certain altitudes and in certain types of maneuvers. But it was competitive. As a result, the period of Fw-190 dominance, which had seemed so complete in 1942, began to wane. The sheer production capacity of the Allies, the constantly improving quality of British and American aircraft, and the accumulation of experience meant that the tactical advantage the Fw-190 had briefly held was gradually eroded. By 1944, the Fw-190 was a good fighter, but it was no longer clearly superior to the Spitfire Mach-18 or to the P-51 Mustang, or to the other fighters that the Allies had by then put into production. The revolution that might have been, had the Fw-190 been fully understood and fully exploited, had been prevented by the fact that it had been captured, tested, and its secrets revealed. There is a touching detail about Armin Faber, the man whose mistake gave the RAF their first intact Fw-190. He was taken prisoner after his landing at RAF Pembry, and was later interrogated extensively by British intelligence officers. He was held as a prisoner of war in Canada, a long way from his home, yet he survived the war. He was repatriated to Germany near the end of the conflict, reportedly by prisoner exchange because he was suffering from health problems, possibly epilepsy. Most remarkably, he resumed flying for the Luftwaffe in the final weeks of the war. A man who had accidentally handed the Allies the secrets of the Fw-190, then went back to flying combat missions. There is something both tragic and darkly comic in this detail. But there is also something important in it. Faber had been trained as a fighter pilot in the German Air Force. He had been taught to fly with courage, skill, and dedication. When he was in combat over the Channel on that June morning in 1942, when he defeated a Spitfire in a head-on engagement, he was operating at the peak of his capabilities. His mistake, the navigation error that led him to land at RAF Pembry instead of continuing to France, was a human error, not a failure of skill or courage. And when he was given the opportunity to resume flying, despite everything that had happened, despite the fact that he was a prisoner who had accidentally benefited the enemy, he took it. This speaks to something about the nature of the fighter pilot. Across all nations, in all eras, the machine mattered, the tactics mattered, but the pilot mattered most of all. What if the Fw-190 energy tactics had dominated the Spitfire? What would have been different? In the immediate sense, the answer is relatively clear. The casualty rate among RAF pilots would have been higher. The pressure on fighter command would have been greater. The transition to new aircraft types would have had to happen faster and perhaps more urgently. The morale impact on British pilots would have been more severe. But in the larger picture, the outcome would likely not have been fundamentally different. The Allies' industrial capacity was simply too great. The production of new aircraft, the training of new pilots, and the development of better tactics would have eventually overcome the Fw-190 advantage. By 1944, with the massive production of aircraft by American factories, the question of whether the Fw-190 or the Spitfire had local superiority in 1942 would have seemed quaintly academic. Yet there is a symbolic importance to what the Fw-190 represented. It was the Luftwaffe's answer to the Spitfire. It was a machine designed to contest the air superiority that the RAF had claimed over Britain in 1940. In some ways, it succeeded. In the middle years of the war, it was a genuine threat, a machine that British pilots had to respect and fear. It was proof that the Spitfire, for all its grace and power, was not invincible. It was proof that the war in the air was not going to be won by superior industrial capacity alone, but by the combination of superior machines, superior tactics, and superior pilots. The Fw-190 represented an innovation in each of these categories. It was a better machine. It embodied a superior tactical philosophy, at least in the narrow context of energy fighting. And it was flown by pilots who understood that a new era of air combat had begun. If that new era had been fully realized, if the Fw-190 had appeared in greater numbers, if it had been flown by pilots trained from the beginning in energy tactics, if the Luftwaffe had grasped its significance and reorganized their entire fighter force around the principles it embodied, then the air war over Europe would have been different. But different is not the same as determined. The Fw-190 was a magnificent machine, a beautiful expression of engineering and design. It was a revolutionary fighter. But it could not by itself have changed the course of the war. What it could have done was to extend the period of uncertainty, to delay the moment when the Allies achieved clear air superiority, to inflict greater costs on the RAF and its pilots. In the end, what the Fw-190 represented was not a revolution in warfare, but a moment of pause. A brief period when the outcome was in genuine doubt, when the future seemed uncertain, when the air seemed to belong to no one. These moments are rare in warfare. Usually one side gradually asserts dominance and the other gradually loses it. But sometimes, briefly, there is a balance. There is a moment when victory is genuinely in doubt. The Fw-190 created such a moment. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and it passed as all such moments must. But for the men who flew it, and for the men who flew against it, it was everything. It was the totality of their experience, the focus of their training, the measure of their courage and their skill. They did not care about the larger historical context. They cared about whether they would survive their next sortie, whether their machine would be faster than the machine opposing them, whether their training and their instincts would carry them through. For them, the Fw-190 was not a symbol or a historical moment. It was the reality they inhabited every day. It was a machine that could kill them. It was a machine they could kill in. It was, in its way, everything. And perhaps that is the truest answer to the question of what if. The Fw-190 energy tactics did dominate the Spitfire for a time. They killed British pilots. They damaged British confidence. They proved that the Spitfire, for all its qualities, was not invincible. They proved that there was more than one way to fly a fighter, more than one way to fight in the air. But in the end, they proved something else as well. That courage and skill and the will to continue fighting mattered more than any single machine or any single tactic. The Fw-190 was a superior machine in many ways. But the British, faced with this superiority, did not surrender. They adapted. They innovated. They produced new aircraft, trained new pilots, and developed new tactics. And eventually they prevailed. That is not a tragedy. It is the reality of warfare. It is also, in its way, a testament to something more important than machine or tactic. It is a testament to the human capacity for resilience, for adaptation, and for the will to endure. The Fw-190 was a beautiful machine. It was also an instrument of death. It represented for a brief moment a superior technology and a superior tactic, but it could not overcome the fundamental realities of the war. The production capacity of the Allies, the number of pilots they could train, the resources they could devote to the air war. In the end, these things mattered more than any individual innovation. Yet in remembering the Fw-190, and the moment when it seemed to promise a different outcome, we are reminded of something important. We are reminded that history is contingent. It is not predetermined. The Fw-190 showed that alternatives existed. Different aircraft, different tactics, different training regimes might have produced different results. The men who flew these machines understood this. They understood that they were operating in a moment of genuine uncertainty. And they did their duty, as men in war have always done, never knowing whether their sacrifice would ultimately contribute to victory or defeat. The sun rises again over the channel. The Fw-190 is gone like everything from that era. The Spitfire has become a legend, an icon of British courage and technological achievement. The men who flew them, German and British alike, are mostly gone as well. What remains is the memory of their struggle, the knowledge of what they endured, and the recognition that in a different world, in a world where different choices were made and different paths were taken, the outcome might have been different, but it would not have been better. It would only have been different. And perhaps that is all that the what-if scenario can ever tell us, that history is contingent, that choices matter, and that the men who lived through it had no way of knowing how things would turn out. All they could do was their duty, fly their machines, and hope that when the day was done they would still be alive.